Welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. You can visit Dr. Johnson's blog at benwoodpost.com. Dr. Johnson's works can be found at drbenwoodjohnson.com. You can also support Dr. Johnson on Patreon, the link to which is in the description. Hey. Welcome back to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. Today is February 8, 2021. This is podcast number 59. Today we're going to continue our conversation about legal obligation. But today in particular we're going to talk about the notion of compelling yourself. And it's this idea that when there is an obligation, a legal obligation in particular, you as a person have an obligation to compel yourself to obey. In other words, you have to make yourself obey. And the failure of you to do so is going to create a situation where enforcement or law enforcement entities are going to compel you to compel yourself. And in some cases, they are going to make you obey. And it is important because that's the foundation of legal obligation. Of course, in subsequent podcasts and subsequent episodes, we're going to talk about the notion of self-imposed duty. We're going to examine the degree to which the person has this inherent desire to obey. So for now, we're going to focus on the idea of compelling the self. So without further ado, let us delve right into it. Last week, we talked about legal obligation, and we talked about the implications of the context, or at least of the concept for the person, for the citizen. But this week, we're going to talk about legal obligation in terms of the individual himself. When we talk about legal obligation, it is an obligation that is legally binding. In other words, you have an obligation that is required by law, and that obligation is either to do or to omit from doing. So in this case, the citizen or the person has a duty to compel the self. In other words, so long as you are the citizen of a country or the citizen of a particular environment in which there is an obligation that is legal in nature, in other words, based on sets of rules or laws passed by a legislature and whatnot, you have an obligation to obey whatever that expectation or whatever that duty is. So in that case, you as an individual have a duty to compel yourself. You have an obligation to make yourself do what it is that the law requires of you or from you. Now, this is easier said than done because people are not inherently obedient. In fact, human beings are not inherently obedient. In other words, we were not born to obey. Human beings were not designed, and by design I mean naturally, intrinsically, or fundamentally designed to obey. Our intrinsic proclivities is to be rebels, is to disobey, is to be our own selves, is to do things according to how we see fit. That is why every individual is unique in the sense that every person has his own perspective about how things are and how things ought to be. But when you live in a collective, or when you live in a society, those individual proclivities have somewhat become irrelevant, because the collective desire to see the individual to be a certain way overrides the individual's desire to be a certain way. Therefore, once the collective obligates you as an individual, you have a duty to obligate yourself. You have an obligation to compel yourself. But this is not possible. At least this is not always possible. So oftentimes, what you see is that there ought to be a mechanism which forces the being to compel the self. And as we will discuss throughout the remaining episodes, we will discuss the nature of that enforcement. We will talk about how that enforcement is intrinsically coercive, meaning the individual has to be forced to obey the self. Because as I said in the beginning, human beings are not naturally inclined to obey. They have to be induced to become that way. And that induction can be done via different methods or methodologies, which we will talk about as we go along in these series. But keep in mind that compelling yourself requires you to obey, at least to force yourself to obey. And that is usually based on the mechanism of enforcement that exists in relation to the legality or to the legal foundation of the obligation itself. Now let us look at this from a trivial standpoint. Most people would tell you, let's say you ask somebody, and you who's listening to this podcast, let's say if I ask you, do you believe you're free? And let's say we're talking about freedom here. Do you believe you are free? Do you believe you get to be whatever you want to be? You get to go wherever you want to go? What do you think your answer would be? Now, most people would say, well, yeah, I'm free. Yeah, I get to be whatever I want to be. I get to go wherever I want to go. Of course, we're talking about people who are out of touch with reality. And if you, as my listener right now, if that's the way you feel, you are out of touch with reality. Why would I say something like that? Well, let's look back at the COVID-19. How many people found out that they never really had a say in this? How many people found out that they never really had a say in what happens in this society? Okay? I'm sure a lot of you did find that out. Because during the COVID-19, what we saw around the world is this idea that you had to compel yourself, and the failure of you to compel yourself was met with the brute force of the state, the sheer brute, the machine, to force you, to compel yourself. So in this regard, as I've mentioned in my recent book about freedom, Discourse on Human Freedom, it's available online, so pick it up if you want, in which I talk about how the COVID-19 revealed the grotesque nature of our reality. And you see a lot of people out of touch of that reality who would try to convince you to believe something that you might be living differently. So we are not free to the extent that others want us to be free. So the concept of freedom, it's a fallacy, as I've talked about in that book and in previous podcasts. But for today, let's say we're talking about obligation. Let us say that you are supposed to do something. You're supposed to follow certain rules set forth by authority X, Y, and Z. Again, I'm not asking you to undermine or at least to disobey legal principles and whatnot. That's not what this conversation is about. And I have to put that disclaimer out there right off the front. Because again, I know the nature of discourse in the world these days, particularly here in America. I know the nature of discourse. It's like there's a certain fear to talk about certain things. People are afraid to talk about certain things. But anyway, I don't want to digress. Now, let's say you think you are, you're an adult. You get to make decisions on your own. You get to be on your own. But what happens when you're told that you have to be a certain way? Have you ever been told that you have to come to this place at this time, at this hour, at this moment? Have you ever been told that you cannot be here, you cannot be there, you cannot park here, you cannot park there, you cannot drive at that speed, you cannot dress this way, you cannot say these words, you cannot think that way? Of course, some of what I'm saying here are not legally binded, but most of them are, because in certain environments, certain regions, you are obligated to obligate yourself, to compel yourself to do all of these things. How do you do that? Let's say you're told that you cannot drive at a speed limit that is above 65. The obligation here is that you have to drive below 65. How do you obligate yourself not to drive above 65? Of course, it's not possible, because most of us do drive above 65 for the most part. Even if we didn't want to, sometimes we find ourselves driving 66 or 67 miles an hour. So in that case, what do? How do you obligate yourself? Well, in this example, what you would see is that the person would obligate themselves to drive below 65 miles an hour, not necessarily because he or she is inherently some sort of an angel. She always do the right thing, this nonsensical idea that you do the right thing. Right? The person would slow down on the highway because he or she knows that there might be a police trooper somewhere. There might be a camera, a speed camera somewhere that is going to catch that 67 or 68 driving, or that person driving above the speed limit. So at that time, the person is going to compel the self to obey, because the person doesn't want a traffic ticket. The person doesn't want to have to deal with the police while he or she is late for work. The person doesn't want to have to deal with this. And if you happen to be a black person, it might even be a stretch to put yourself in this situation, having to deal with police officers at a certain time, at a certain places. So you are going to compel yourself to obey. Let's take another example. Suppose that you work at this particular institution, and according to the rules of that institution, you have to be at work at a certain time during the day. For example, you are supposed to start work at 9 o'clock every day. And as you start work at 9 o'clock, you are supposed to leave work at 5 o'clock. Okay? Now, this obligation for you to be at work at 9 o'clock is incumbent upon you being a good employee, because your capacity to maintain that job is relative to you following the rules set forth by whoever your employer is. And if the employer says you have to be at work at 9 o'clock, you have to be at work at 9 o'clock. And therefore, you are going to obligate yourself to be at work at 9 o'clock. It has nothing to do with your intrinsic understanding of what humanness is or what personhood is. You are going to obligate yourself. You are going to compel yourself to be at this location at this time. And to illustrate the example I gave earlier about the COVID-19, is that what we saw this deliberate attempt, what is this deliberate desire on the part of certain individuals to overreach their capacity to make others do or omit from doing. And we're not going to belabor that point, because we've talked about how the COVID-19 was sort of like, it was blatant, it was all right there. Even the idea that they're circulating these days about asking you to wear double, triple mask and all that, it's still within this idea that you as an individual have absolutely no say in this. You automatically are obligated to obligate yourself to wear those appendages, whether you like it or not. Okay? So when we're talking about obligation, when we're talking about legal obligation, you are supposed to compel yourself to obligate. You are supposed to compel yourself to obey. You're supposed to induce yourself to obey whatever rule or law that is in effect in a particular environment. But it would not be because you are intrinsically compelled to do so.